All right, everybody, thank you for coming to see me. My name is Rich Roll. I am a plant-based ultra-endurance triathlete. I'm an author. I wrote a book called Finding Ultra that came out last year. And I'm really happy to be speaking here at the Seed. I want to thank everybody at the Seed who invited me out and has helped put on this amazing event. It's pretty cool to be here and to see so many people interested in healthy lifestyle, eating more plants, and it's really an honor to be able to play a small part in this evolving and growing movement of plant-based nutrition. So anyway, I want to start this off by asking a simple question. Who here wants to be more healthy? Yes, of course, right? We all do. That's why we're here. You wouldn't be here. We all want to be fit as we can. We want to live longer. We want increased energy. We want to become bulletproof to Western disease. So, you know, today it's a little bit of preaching to the choir because you guys are already somewhat converted, I guess, from some of the audiences that I am want to speak with. But of course, we all want these things, right? And this is why the diet industry is so massive. It's huge business. $20 billion a year is spent by Americans on weight loss and diet products. 108 million Americans will tell you at any given time that they're on a diet. But do diets work? Well, sometimes we think they do, but why don't we look at the statistics? When you look at the statistics, it paints a pretty dismal picture. I mean, we are the most prosperous nation on earth. And yet, as a culture, as a society, we have never been more unfit or more unhealthy. 42% of adult Americans are obese. Childhood obesity rates are through the roof, costing us $147 billion a year. Heart disease remains our #1 killer. Every year, almost 1 million Americans suffer a heart attack, 385,000 of which are fatal. 28 million people worldwide suffer from cancer. Diabetes rates are through the roof. This is crazy. This is crazy that this is what we're dealing with in 2013. So you can't help but draw the conclusion that maybe diets don't work. But why? I mean, we look at the statistics, and I think most sort of half-intelligent people kind of know what to do. You know, they know that drinking too much soda is bad. They know that fast food is bad. And they know that eating more vegetables and fruits is good, and yet we don't do it. There's this incredible disconnect between the information and the implementation in our lives. And, you know, if we look at, like, what are the reasons? Well, of course, fast food, right? The proliferation of fast food, and due to farm subsidies, this food is essentially the same price that it was when I was a kid. You know, I don't know about you, but I still crave this stuff. I ate this stuff for a very long time, and it's a huge problem. You know, what are some of the other problems that we face? Well, again, fast food, the sort of advent of processed foods. Grocery stores are huge these days, and yet most of the middle aisles are filled with processed foods that are laden with chemicals and artificial preservatives and coloring, etc. Most of the foods in the middle aisles of your grocery store really aren't that good for you. You have to go to the aisles to get the fresh fruits and the vegetables and the foods that are actually nourishing to our bodies. We've got factory farming, which is depleting our soil and lowering the nutritional density of the foods that we're eating. We have this explosion of GMOs. We're more stressed out than we've ever been. We're leading more sedentary lifestyles of convenience and distraction. Everybody's wed to their iPad and their iPhone and playing video games and going to the movies and in front of their big flat screen TV. And when we get sick, we don't get to the cause of what's making us sick and treat that. We treat the symptoms so we can go about our merry way and not disrupt our lifestyle or these habits around food that we formed that are continuing to make us sick. So I would actually go so far as to say that we are addicted. We are addicted as a culture to foods that fail us, to lifestyles that are leading to illness, and to pharmaceuticals that are treating symptoms without any discussion whatsoever of what's causing these illnesses to creep up. All told, this is separating us from our true nature, which is to be healthy, fit, and happy. And it sounds a little bit weird to say addicted. I'm a recovering alcoholic. I come from an addiction perspective. I'm very in touch with this. I'm very in touch with my addiction issues related to food. And it starts to sound like a conspiracy theory when you talk about food addictions. And I'm not talking about necessarily addictions that lead us to obesity, but which just lead us to make the wrong choice in a snap. And there's a book that just recently came out. It was on the New York Times bestseller list. It's called Salt, Sugar, Fat. If you haven't heard of it or you haven't read it, I implore you to go and check it out. And basically what it is it's a look at the big food companies and how they specifically design foods with the ingredients that they put in them to trigger our pleasure centers that keep us coming back, that basically imprison us to continuing to eat foods that aren't good for us. So it's called Salt, Sugar, Fat. Yeah, you should be able to find it pretty much in any bookstore. So what's the solution? How do we deal with this and how do we get well? It's easy to point your finger at all the things we just talked about. Point your finger at fast food, at GMOs and factory farming, and it's terrible. But in order to change, we have to take that finger and we got to turn it around, we got to point it at ourselves. Each and every one of us has to take personal responsibility for the choices that we are making, for the foods that we're putting in our mouth. You have to snap the denial that is imprisoning you to these poor choices and confront the truth about the foods that you're eating and the lifestyle that you're leading. In other words, focusing on the things that you have control over. Because at the end of the day, nobody can tell you what to put down your throat, and that's the truth. So, my personal bias is that a plant-based whole food lifestyle, notice how I didn't say diet, is the optimal pathway to wellness. And when my book came out about a year ago, I had the good fortune of traveling around and speaking at a lot of events, kind of similar to this one. I spoke here last year. And I had the honor of getting to meet and spend time with some of the pioneers, the kind of paradigm-busting personalities and authorities in this world. People like Dr. Caldwell Esselstyn, T. Colin Campbell, Rip Esselstyn, who had a book that just came out this week called My Beef with Meat. And I've become more convinced than ever that eating a plant-based whole food lifestyle is the best way to not just be healthy and be trim, but to prevent and actually in many cases reverse the onset of many of these Western illnesses, including heart disease, that are unnecessarily killing way too many of us. In addition, you can be an athlete on it too. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. So, can everybody hear me okay? It's a little bit loud out there, so is it okay? All right. So what is a plant-based whole food lifestyle? Well, essentially it means that when it comes to eating, you eat nothing with a mother and nothing with a face, right? No eggs, no dairy, no fish, no beef, no cheese. Well, that's pretty outrageous, right? I mean, it's pretty severe, right? Like, who could do that? It's crazy. Like, basically, I just listed all the things that most people eat. Like, you're taking all of that away, and like, what's left to eat? Simply outrageous. Well, I would actually submit that this is outrageous. Having your chest cavity pried open, bypass surgery, having stents put in, heart surgery, and the like. And unfortunately, this has become the norm in America, especially with middle-aged men. It's almost normal. Oh yeah, I had a stent put in. All right, bypass surgery. That is far more likely to come up in conversation than the idea of, hey, I'm eating plants, which is seemingly more outrageous than having heart surgery. And there's something very, very wrong with that picture. Not to mention the fact that it is, in many, many cases, is completely unnecessary. So, it's time, people. Is it time? Is it time to put a stop to this nonsense? It's time, right? It's time to reverse this trend. It's so hard, though. I like ice cream. It's so hard. Lucky for you, here are the 10 tips. I'm going to wrap up this conversation right now with 10 tips and send you on your way. You'll never have to look back or worry about this ever again, right? Well, it doesn't really work that way. I mean, I could give you 10 tips that I think would be helpful, but in my experience, that's not really the way humans operate. You know, again, it goes back to this gap, this disconnection between the information and the implementation. So instead of showing you a bunch of statistics, a bunch of food groups and graphs, I'm going to switch directions, and instead I'm just going to tell you a little story. It's my story. This is me back in 1985. Good times, right? It's me. In this picture, I was a freshman in college. I was a freshman at Stanford University, doing what any good freshman in college should be doing, right? Having a good time. And at the time, the world was my oyster. I'd gotten into every college that I had applied to. I was 8 for 8. I got into Harvard. I got into Princeton. I decided to go to Stanford because Stanford had the best swimming program in the country. I was a competitive swimmer at the time. So I joined the swim team at Stanford. I was recruited to swim there. I was world ranked at the time. And was training alongside Olympic champions, world record holders, American record holders, NC2A champions. And the coach of the swim team was grooming me to be team captain of this team. Essentially, everything that I had done in my life up to this point was lining up perfectly for me to have the life that I had always dreamed of. And a little problem crept up around this time, which is that doing what you see in this picture simply became much more interesting to me than anything else. My life started to get small, and my focus was really just on finding where my next good time was going to be. That fun that I'm having in this picture morphed into a need, and that need turned into a very dark addiction that took me to some pretty dark places. So all I cared about was being altered, disassociated from myself, numb, disconnected from everything and everyone, like I said, including myself. So 14 years ago, I couldn't leave my crappy apartment without being drunk. I started the day every morning with vodka tonics in the shower, a beer between my legs as I drove to work, sneaking drinks throughout the day, hiding empties, lying to everybody, including myself, and leading this double life, or seemingly double life. I thought I was getting away with it. But of course, like most alcoholics, people around them tend to know what's going on. My weekends were lost in binge-fueled blackouts. I'd awake to the DTs, trembling, hallucinations, bed spins, vomiting, and several sleepless nights until I could get back to normal. Until at the end, I was unemployable, unreliable, alienated from my family who didn't want anything to do with me anymore, and one step from homelessness. I was basically sleeping on a bare mattress on the floor of an apartment that otherwise had no furniture at the time. And of course, I knew I was an alcoholic. It was obvious. And I tried to stop. I tried to stop many, many times. I tried everything. And in my mind, and this is kind of an important point, I was relying on my self-will to address and solve this problem. Because in my mind, my self-will was the one thing that I thought was responsible for all the success that I had achieved as a youngster. Because I was never the best student. I wasn't the most talented athlete. But I could bridge that deficit by working harder than my friends and come up to snuff. And I figured if I could just apply this self-will in the right way to this alcohol problem, that I could solve it. And every time I tried to do that, I failed. And it got worse and worse and worse. Until one day I was in so much pain that I woke up and I became willing to look at the problem from a different perspective. I became willing to let other people help me. I became willing to take direction, to perceive the problem from a completely different point of view that involved letting go of my self-will and actually surrendering to the problem. And it's something that took me years to kind of understand and grasp. But it was that mental shift that allowed me to finally get a grip on this problem and begin the journey to getting sober. And this becomes a little bit relevant later in my story. So what happened was I ended up going to rehab. I thought I was going to go for like 2 weeks and do a spin dry and get back to my job as a lawyer. And during the first week, one of the counselors said, well, why don't you, he gave me a written assignment. He said, I want you to write out 10 times when you thought where your drinking led you astray into some terrible circumstance. And so I did the assignment, and I had to read it out loud before a group of people. And then the counselor said to me, yeah, you know what? We think you ought to stick around a little bit longer than 21 days. Like, you have the advanced state of alcoholism that we typically see in like a 65-year-old male. And again, I had surrendered and I was willing. I took direction and I ended up staying in rehab for 100 days, and that saved my life. So what happened during that time is that I was given new tools to approach my life, a new way of living, a new way of approaching my life so that I could navigate this world in a sober state, which was very different than how I had approached it previously. And it worked. I got out of rehab, and I was able, in a rather short period of time, to get all the things back into my life that I'd lost. I repaired my relationships. I became a responsible member of society. I was able to look somebody in the face and have a conversation. I was able to show up on time, do as I was told, and engender trust and tell the truth and all of those things, right? And I became very focused on sort of getting back to where I was before. I started working really hard, and it was paying off. I was on the partnership track at a big law firm. I met my wife, we got married, we started having kids, we built this amazing house that we lived in, and in many ways, it was the fulfillment of the American dream. I had everything that I thought that I ever wanted, and all those things that seemed so elusive and out of my grasp when I was drinking. So in many senses, it was a miracle. The problem is, I'd overlooked one crucial aspect of my life, and that was my health and my wellness. So this is me when I was 39 years old. I'm 46 now. So as you can see, I look a little bit different in this picture than I do now. 210 pounds, I weigh about 160, 165 now. And it's not that I was obese, basically looked like most overworked lawyers at the time, really, which was kind of normal. Oh, he's filling out, it's kind of like what my peers look like. But more importantly, it was my energy levels. I felt horrible all the time. I never slept well. I was disinterested in most things in life. I was depressed, disconnected, and basically addicted to these foods that were killing me at the time. I had worked so hard to get sober, and yet all of that addictive behavior, that addictive mindset that used to drive me towards drugs and alcohol were driving me towards food. And I developed what a friend of mine calls the window diet. If you can roll down the window and they hand it to you, you eat it. And that was like my nutritional regimen, right? And these habits, these dietary habits, were formed as a swimmer when I was a youngster, and I'm training like 4 hours a day, and calories are king, and it almost doesn't matter what you eat. That was how I learned my approach to food, and those habits became cemented. Cemented neural pathways in my brain became very, very difficult to break. And even though I wasn't training or a swimmer anymore, I still continued to believe that I could eat that way, and that's the power of denial. So, switching mics. Is that better? Is that better?
Battery's about to die.
Oh, okay, battery's going out. Not quite so loud. So here I am, 39 years old, overweight, and like I said, depressed. It was a very disorienting, confusing time in my life. Like, on the one hand, I'd done so much to get my life back, and then on the other hand, like, why did I feel this way? It was like this hole in my gut, this hole in my spirit. No matter what I did, I couldn't fill it. No new car that I would buy, or no thing was going to make it better. And believe me, I tried everything. And so it led me to this very desperate point of not understanding what I was going to do or how I was going to snap out of this. And one of my favorite writers, Henry David Thoreau, famously said, "The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation, and what is considered resignation is confirmed desperation." And that was certainly me. And it may have been true in Thoreau's time, and I think that it is continues to be true today, if not more so. You know, I felt trapped in this life that I didn't feel like I necessarily chose. I had been on this habit trail my whole life, chasing this American dream that I'd been fed and told my whole life would make me happy. You know, get the good job, go to the right school, you know, live in the right place, drive the right car, all of these things. And I did it all. And here I was sitting on top of this and just completely unhappy with where I had arrived. And it was a very it was a crisis for me. And it all kind of came to a head just before I turned 40. I'd come home late from work that night. My family was already asleep. My kids were asleep. My wife was asleep. We stayed up late watching reruns on TV, eating cheeseburgers out of a bag from Jack in the Box, I think it was. And at about 2 in the morning, I was ready to call it a night. Turned the lights off, started heading up the stairs to go to bed. Halfway up the staircase, I had to stop. I was winded. I was out of breath. I had sweat on my brow. I had a tightness in my chest, and I was having a panic attack. I didn't know what was happening to me. All of these bad habits, these addictions to food, this lifestyle that I was leading that was so disconnected from this other part of myself that I had lost, all kind of conspired in this one moment to make it crystal clear to me that I needed to change, that I needed to make a drastic change in how I was living my life if I wanted to continue to live. You know, my mother would always tell me growing up, heart disease runs in the family, you got to be careful. Her father, my grandfather, had died of a heart attack when he was 54 years old when she was still in college. I never met him. I'm named after him. I never had the opportunity to meet him despite the fact that he had been a swimmer like myself. But when you're young, those messages just go in one ear and out the other. Yeah. You know, and in my experience, the only true thing that has ever motivated me to make a crucial change in my life has been pain. Not that you need pain to change, but that's just been my experience. So in that moment, I knew I needed to make a change. And what happened was, because I had this line in the sand moment with getting sober, waking up that one day and realizing that I knew I had a very brief window of opportunity in which to grab onto it and change my life by letting go of alcohol, this felt very similar. It was like it was happening all over again. And because of that experience getting sober, I was able to recognize the very special, unique, and fleeting nature of this moment, and I knew that I needed to act. And I needed to act swiftly and decisively, because if I just said, oh, you know what, I'll think about that tomorrow, I'll deal with that later, and just blew it off, that moment would pass, that door would shut, that line in the sand would get erased, and I'd be back to doing whatever I was doing. So, what did I do? Well, the next morning, I turned to my wife. I wish that I could say that I immediately showed up at the SEED conference and met all the people here and listened to the speakers and read a bunch of books, read the Engine 2 Diet, read the China Study, watched Forks Over Knives. I would have saved a lot of time, believe me. I wish that I had done all those things. Unfortunately, I didn't do any of those things. I turned to my wife. My wife, Julie, has always been much healthier than me. She's like a yoga teacher, meditation practitioner, always reading this spiritual text and that spiritual text, and always trying to improve herself. And although not plant-based at the time, very interested in healthy eating. So much so that if you were to open up our refrigerator, there was a pretty clear demarcation line down the middle between the foods that she was eating and the foods that I was eating. They bore no resemblance to each other. And a very interesting thing had happened to her back in 2004. Julie developed a growth on her neck that was about the size of a golf ball. It looked like a goiter, and of course, nervous and sort of panicked, we went to the doctor. We saw all the specialists. We went to Cedars-Sinai in Los Angeles. We went to UCLA Medical Center, and all of the specialists said the same thing. It was diagnosed as a thyroglossal duct cyst. It was a tumorous growth And the good news was that it wasn't malignant. It was a benign growth. The bad news was it was never going to go away. In fact, it would probably continue to slowly grow. And the only way that it was going to be removed was by surgery. It was going to have to be cut out. And by the way, not a small surgery, because it was attached to some vertebrae bone and there's some nerves around there, and it was a little bit dicey. So, not like open heart surgery, but then again, like not a wham, bam, thank you, ma'am, easy process either. And Julie, some years prior to this, had suffered a botched tonsillectomy that left her in bed rest for about 6 weeks on a juice diet because something had gone wrong during this procedure. So she was in no hurry to have anybody cut her neck open. That was not going to happen. She decided that she was going to try to heal this condition herself, despite the fact that all of these Western doctors told her that it was absolutely impossible. She sought the advice of an Ayurvedic doctor who explained to her that he thought it was going to be no problem to cure this. And I'm coming from a very science background, traditional education. Where are the facts? I want to read the studies. She didn't have any of that. But if you want to be happily married, you support your spouse. And so I was in a position of having to support her doing something that I had a hard time believing was going to be effective. And I was concerned and I was worried. So she seeks out the advice of this doctor. She returns with all of these strange baggies filled with it looked like dried leaves, all these herbs and some kind of foul-smelling paste that made the whole kitchen smell terrible, and a pretty strict, predominantly plant-based diet. So it was a whole routine that she had to do. And it involved making all these crazy brews and these teas and eating vegetables and fruits, and then rubbing this paste on her neck every night and putting a bandage over it. And at first, nothing happened. The only manifestation that anything was happening was that she broke out in acne all over her face, terribly, and it persisted for months. 3 months later, no change in the size of the growth of this thing. 6 months later, pretty much the same thing. Everybody's getting worried. Her mother's calling me. Her sister's calling me. You have to do something. We need to do something here. You can't let this go on. This is terrible. And the thing was big. She got in public and people would comment on it. She was adamant. She stuck to it. And about 9 months into this process, it started to go down. And by a year, it was completely gone. And it has never come back. Now, I'm sure that if you were, don't thank me. I was trying to talk her out of it. Yeah. I will let her know that you clap, though. She'll be very happy. I'm sure that a Western doctor could get up here and maybe there's some explanation for why this occurred, despite the fact that all the doctors said that it never would. But the important thing for purposes of what we're talking about is that it was the first time that I'd ever seen somebody heal themselves with food. And of course, we've all heard the Hippocrates' famous statement, let food be thy medicine and medicine be thy food. But that was really the first moment where I actually thought about that, thought about what it meant, and saw it affect her life in a positive way, and it was powerful. So that explains why I turned to her to help me. So I said, hey, Julie, by the way, I didn't tell her what happened on the staircase. I was too embarrassed. The next morning I said, hey, that like juice cleanse you did like last year? Like I think I want to try that. And she looked at me as if I just said, the high heels and that dress in the closet? Like, I'm going to wear that to work today. This is how out of character something like this was for me. Fine for her, not my deal. But pain is a great motivator, and I was desperate to change, and I knew I needed to act. So I jumped in and I did this. Zero expectations of it having any impact on how I would feel. I just knew that I needed to do something. So I did it. I did this 7-day fruit and vegetable juice detox cleanse. And again, me being the science-minded guy, I was like, what exactly am I detoxing off of? And what are these toxins anyway? And how is doing this going to have any impact on removing that, which I don't believe even exists, from my body? That would be my normal line of inquiry. I threw that out the window because I was surrendering in the same way that when I got sober, I had to surrender and let go of my way of doing things, the way my brain works, and accept help from somebody else. First 2 days of this detox cleanse, juice cleanse thing, I was buckled over in the couch, sweating. I felt like I was back in rehab. I figured this is what it must feel like to detox off heroin. I couldn't move. It was terrible. But weathering a detox is something that I've done many times before, and I knew that if I stuck it out, things would start to change. Day 3, I felt a little bit better. Day 4, I felt, I feel actually pretty good. Day 5, everything changed. On day 5, I woke up with a sense of renewed vitality and vigor than I could remember in my whole life. I'm not sure I ever felt better, ever. And that led me to believe, again, that there is this equation between food and health and how we feel. Of course, you have to go back to eating food when this 7 days was over, and I'd experienced such an incredible resurgence in energy, focus, vitality. Being the good sort of alcoholic that I am, I was like, I'm just going to drink juice from now on. I'm not going to eat food anymore. I don't need to. Why I feel so good now. Julie's like, listen, you got to eat food. So what am I going to do? What am I going to eat? And again, I wish I came to the seed, saw all these speakers, and got a good idea of what I should and shouldn't eat. I didn't do that. I decided, out of the blue and without any research or reading any books, that I would try a vegetarian diet. Now, why a vegetarian diet? Well, it sounded better than what I was doing. It's got to be better than going to Jack in the Box every day, right? And it is. But I think the real reason that I chose that at this time and where I was in my life at that moment was that it was very black and white. You know, I tend to see things through a prism of recovery and addiction. And in recovery, they teach you, you're either drinking or you're sober. You're either using drugs or you're clean. There's no gray area. There's no middle ground. It's one or the other. And vegetarianism seemed to speak to me on that level. It's sort of like, okay, I can wrap my brain around that. It's like you're either eating meat or you're not eating meat. I get it. I can do that. It seemed doable to me, and I started to do that. But the problem is that in addition to being a recovering alcoholic, I'm also a lawyer. And I think like a lawyer, and I thought, and I'm always looking for the loophole, right? Like, what's the loophole here? Where's the easy way around this? I was like, oh, I can go to Pizza Hut and just not get pepperoni on that pizza, and I can eat fries at McDonald's. That's vegetarian, right? Like all these fast foods that I used to eat, I found myself going back and eating them because they technically fell within the definition of this program that I had established for myself. So, of course, not very long before I'm back on the couch, depressed, lethargic, going, well, that was a good shot, you know, but I guess it didn't work for me. Diets don't work, right? So I'm just going to happily and guilt-free go back to my old ways, and whatever happens, happens. Then I started to think about this guy. I mentioned him earlier. Richard Spinell is my grandfather that I never met, my namesake, my doppelganger, and like me, had been a champion swimmer. He was an Olympic hopeful. He was captain of the University of Michigan swim team in the late 1920s. Had an American record at one point. Was a contemporary of like Johnny Weissmuller and all these great swimmers of the day. Michigan was sort of like the Stanford of its day in terms of swimming. And yet, never met him. Died of a heart attack at age 54. And this was a guy who always ate well, who remained active. He remained involved in the sport of swimming, continued to swim daily in his beloved Lake Michigan during the summer months. Never smoked, never overweight, dead of a heart attack at 54. And I knew that I was headed in that direction. And that if I didn't want to die like he did, that I was going to have to take this to the next level and get serious this time. And so I thought, what would happen if I got rid of all the kind of end runs I was trying to do? And what would happen if I cut the dairy out of my diet and all these processed foods that I was eating? I decided to try it. Again, no expectations. In fact, I didn't think it would work. I was hoping it wouldn't work, and then I could, again, guilt-free, go back to doing what I was doing and tell my wife that I tried. And an amazing thing happened. Once again, much like when I tried that juice cleanse, within 7 to 10 days of making this switch, I felt like a completely different person. My energy levels were through the roof. I had so much energy, I didn't know what to do with it. I could see better, I could hear better, my skin cleared up. I had a vitality and a sense of myself that I had never experienced before, and I realized that I was onto something. And that is when I started to read the books, try to educate myself, because I knew I was onto something, and I wanted to keep going. And so what did that look like? Well, yes, the plant power diet. The more I read, the more I realized this connection between Western disease and lifestyle and food that we're eating, this idea that food could be preventative medicine. And I started being active. I started getting outside. I happen to live in a very beautiful part of Los Angeles, surrounded by trails and mountains, none of which I'd ever spent any time exploring. I didn't even really know what was there. I bought a pair of running shoes. My wife bought me a bike for my birthday. I'd never ridden a bike before. And I jumped into the pool once in a while. And my only goal at the time was to try to reconnect with this part of me that I had lost, this part of me that as a youth that loved swimming, that loved being outdoors, that loved the fresh air and having my heart rate elevated. I wanted to tap back into that, and the better I felt, the more I wanted that. I just wanted to lose a little bit of my gut and actually just have the energy level to enjoy my children and my family and be able to stick around. And that was it. That was my only aspiration at the time. And then something happened. It was a couple months into this, still what I would call an experiment. And I went out for a run. I'd been running, maybe 2 or 3 times a week. It's a couple months of trying to get fit again and starting to feel good in my body. And it was a weekday morning, I think it was a Tuesday morning. I went to a local trail near my house. I was going to run for 45 minutes, maybe an hour. It was a work day, I had to get to work. And it's just one of those days where if you're a runner or a creative person or any kind of athlete or somebody that's project-oriented, maybe you've experienced this, where everything just clicks and you're in the groove and time disappears and you feel bulletproof. And with every step that I took in that run, I felt better, more energized, more powerful. I felt completely in tune with my body. Time went away and I lost track of how far I'd been going, how long I'd been running, until I kind of came to on the trail and realized that I'd been running for almost 2 hours away from my car. It was hot, too. I didn't have any water. I had nothing, and I had a little panic attack. I said, oh, my God, I better turn around. I don't have any water. What happens if I keel over? There's nobody up here. There's nobody around. Turned around, started running back to my car, thinking at any moment my calf is going to seize up, and I'm going to fall in a gutter and get bit by a rattlesnake. But with every mile, I continued to feel great all the way until the end. I ended up running the better part of a marathon that day, almost 24 miles out of the blue, eating nothing but plants, fruits and vegetables, whole grains, legumes. That's it. It was a watershed, another watershed moment for me where I thought, my God, I don't know if I've just unlocked some dormant gene inside of me that I don't know existed, or maybe there's something, this way that I'm eating, this lifestyle that I've adopted, I'm completely underestimating. And it led me to ask myself this question. If I could abuse my body for as long as I had with drugs and alcohol and fast food and terrible lifestyle, high-stress lifestyle, and bounce back this quickly to how I feel now and how my body is performing right now, well, just how resilient is the human body? What is it capable of? I mean, I treated it horribly forever. In such a short period of time, it's bounced back with such force and effectiveness. What would happen if I actually tested this, pushed it further, see how far I could go with it? And that led me to this quest to try to find some kind of challenge, some kind of endurance challenge. I'm 40 years old. It's like, what's on the bucket list, Ironman, maybe I'll do an Ironman. I had friends that had done an Ironman. It seemed like a good bucket list item. Lots of 40-year-old guys signing up for Ironmans. And I was contemplating it, but I don't know, it just wasn't capturing my, it wasn't getting me super excited. Just waiting for that thing to inspire me. And then one day, I was at Jamba Juice after a little morning run. I was waiting for my juice and flipping through a magazine that was on the counter. It was one of those competitor magazines you see in shoe retailers or running shoe stores and things like that. And there was an article about this race. and this guy named David Goggins. David Goggins is a Navy SEAL, former power lifter and football player who at one time weighed, I think, like 280 pounds, had never been a runner. It's like a strength athlete, who decided that he was going to tackle the 10 most difficult endurance challenges in the world to try to raise money and awareness for a nonprofit that would support the families of his wounded brethren who had lost their lives in overseas wars. And he had just completed this race called Ultraman, which I'd never heard of. Many of you have heard of Ironman, and an Ironman, in the period of one day, you do a 2.4-mile swim, a 112-mile bike, and then a marathon. So it's pretty long, right? It's a pretty long race, pretty tough. This race, Ultraman, is more than double that. Over the course of 3 days, you start on day one, you do a 6.2-mile swim followed by a 90-mile bike, the last 20 miles of which are straight up this mountain. The second day, you ride your bike around the other side of the island, 170 miles. And then the third day, you celebrate this whole thing by running 52.4 miles to end up where you started, with double marathon, right? So I'm reading this article about this guy, David Goggins, big guy, super strong. And there's a picture of him running on the lava fields, and he had just done quite well in this race. And I was just captivated. I couldn't believe anything. I'd never heard of this thing before. And but what really struck me was the purity of this race and this experience. The way that this article was written, it made it very clear that this was much more than a race where there's a winner and a loser and a podium. That this was a shared communal spiritual experience, that 35 hand-selected, invitation-only athletes from all over the world congregated on this island to participate in this race. Every athlete had to bring their own crew with them, their own support crew that drives in a vehicle behind them for the 3 days around the race, support them, feed them, nourish them, take care of them, and that all of these crews help the other athletes too. And so, of course, it's a race and somebody wants to win, but the important thing is that everybody participates together to make sure that everybody finishes this race, that it had this spiritual core to it that had nothing to do with sponsorships, no prize money, no media. They don't even shut the roads off. Nobody even knows about this race. It's been here for like 25 years. So I read this article and I think, I've got to do this race. And I don't know what came over me. I'd never run, I hadn't done a marathon. I hadn't done anything. And I couldn't stop thinking about this race. I was like, it was like one of those moments you have in life where something completely illogical just strikes you and you know that's the path that you're meant to go on. Makes no sense. That you're afraid to even tell anybody because it sounds so insane. Couldn't sleep. And I'm like, all right, I'm just going to call the race director of this race so she can tell me I'm crazy and I can like put this to bed and move on with my life. So I called her up. Her name's Jane Bacchus. She's an elderly woman. She's been conducting this race for 25 years. And she says, well, I'm glad that you called. It's quite a while before we're accepting invitations for this race this year. So, I don't know what to tell you, but, we still have a couple months. You can submit your application then. And she goes, well, why don't you tell me what you've done? I go, I haven't done anything. Eaten a lot of cheeseburgers. That's what I've done, But I said, if you could be so gracious as to allow me entrance to this race, I promise you that I will be ready. At which point, she should have said, why don't you call me in a couple years when you've put together a resume of some races and then we can talk about it. That would have been the prudent, logical thing to do, the kind of thing you would expect somebody like that in that position to say. That's not what she said. She said, it means a lot that you called early. What's important to us is to find like-minded people who we feel can contribute something to what we're doing. I'm not saying no. Just give me a call in a couple months and let me know where you're at. It was another crack in the door, another line in the sand to continue this theme. And at that moment, I knew that I would find a way to be in this race, and I started to prepare accordingly. I hired a coach with about 6 months out before I was officially even granted entry. Eventually I wore her down. I started to prepare, I started to train under the auspices of somebody who knew more about this stuff than I did. Like I said, I'd just gotten a bike. I'd never raced a bike before. I'd never been a runner. And I was feeling so good, and as the training started to ramp up, I continued to get stronger. I was recovering quickly in between workouts. I seemed to be progressing nicely and felt like this quite possibly could happen. But in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, yeah, I feel good, but I don't know. Can you really be an athlete just eating plants? Like, is that possible? It defies everything I'd ever been told my whole life. And despite all the evidence that my body was giving me, all the sort of internal feedback that I was getting, I had doubt. I had doubt sitting back there. It's like, milk does a body good. You need to eat steak to be protein. And it makes you realize how powerful those marketing messages are that start getting inundated into our consciousness at such an early age, and how difficult it is to overcome them. I started telling a couple friends what I was doing. I was like, hey, yeah, so I've been eating a lot of plants lately. I feel pretty good, A little weird look, a little weird. Okay, it's cool, Rich, right on. Yeah, and I think I'm going to do this Ultraman race. It's this crazy long race, pretty long. I'm pretty excited about it. I think I can actually do it. To which point, all my friends become gravely concerned. What's wrong with you? You should be what are you doing? Why are you off track in your life? You're supposed to be, in the office doing this, and why aren't you, taking on another case at work or getting more work? And what is this, plant-based thing anyway? You can't be an athlete eating plants. You're going to hurt yourself. This is nuts. We are worried about you. In other words, all of my friends became professional nutritionists overnight. Nobody cared what I was eating when I was eating Jack in the Box every day. That's no problem. But, oh my God, you're not going to eat meat and dairy? There's something wrong with you, Rich. And again, I had those doubts. And I started to research more. And lo and behold, my goodness, there's lots of protein in plants. Lots of protein. And there's a lot of misconceptions about protein, how much we need. We don't need that much. You eat a well-balanced variety of plant-based foods, and you're fine. And 6 years later, and countless 25-hour training weeks under my belt, I can tell you that I continue to get stronger, faster, leaner. Protein is a non-issue. So this idea of eating plant-based went from something I was trying to overcome to be an athlete to suddenly becoming this crazy secret weapon. So what is it, other than this, we've dealt with the protein question, what is it about eating a plant-based diet that could be an advantage for an athlete? And the whole reason I want to talk about this is just because I want to put a picture of my daughter up there, because she's cute, right? That's Jaya. She loves broccoli. And what I learned was that when you're eating a plant-based diet, it's predominantly alkaline forming. What does that mean? Well, our bodies have to work very hard to create a homeostatic pH in our system, right? So if you're eating, the standard American diet is very acid forming. So when you're eating the standard American diet and you're living a very stressful life and you're breathing in the toxins and the fumes from automobiles and the like, all of this contributes to what is commonly understood as a state of chronic acidosis. And when you're in this state, your body has to work very hard to move that pH back to neutral. And what happens is you end up leaching minerals from your bones. Your immune system goes into overdrive. You become very inflammatory. There's a lot of inflammation around resolving this. And what does that mean? Inflammation is the state in which disease can arise. Inflammation is a gigantic contributant to all of these Western diseases that are ailing us. And from an athletic perspective, inflammation impedes recovery. When you're eating an alkaline-forming diet, plant-based diet, it's the meat and the dairy that's acid-forming. When you're getting rid of the processed foods and the other acid-forming foods, you're getting rid of that inflammation. You're creating an environment in which your immune system can function at its peak optimally, and your body can expedite the time it takes to recover from the stress induced by training and exercise. So what does that mean? That means that you can train harder, you can train longer, you can recover more quickly, you can reduce the time lost from training due to becoming sick or ill and protracted over the course of a season or a number of years, you will realize tremendous performance gains. And that has certainly been my experience. So, armed with all of this, I show up for this, so this is what happened. If you have a good photographer and good lighting, so yeah, that helps. But more importantly, it's not about the physique. It's about how I felt inside, like I had this internal compass that had suddenly been righted, like I was comfortable in my own skin, that I felt like I was on a trajectory and a direction that made sense for me, like I had recaptured and connected, like I said before, with some part of myself that had been lost, pushed aside through adulthood. I was home. So, despite the protein deficiency that I was suffering in that picture, I decided to follow through with this Ultraman dream. I showed up in 2008 for this race, and I had one goal: don't die. That was it. I wasn't really there to race. I was there to celebrate this change in my lifestyle that had made such a profound impact on me and my marriage and my relationship with my kids. I was celebrating 10 years of sobriety. And this was just a natural extension of this journey. I showed up at this race. I just wanted to participate. I wanted to finish without dying, and I wanted to have fun. So I recruited a top crew. My crew, as you can see, that's my dad. Can't see him there. He knows nothing about bikes. And these are two of my buddies from recovery. They don't know that much either. None of us knew anything. We were like the bad news bears showing up at this race. It's amazing I didn't die. And in fact, I ended up 11th in this race. I was second out of the water on the swim, so thank you. Despite the protein deficiency, right? Which led me back to that question. Just how resilient is the human body? Just how resilient is my body? Had I answered that question, I wasn't so sure that I had. You know, I'd completed this race, but I wasn't racing. You know, what would happen if I actually took a year and prepared and trained and gave it my all and showed up the following year to just see how fast I could go if I really put everything I had into it? So that's what I did. Trained harder, dialed in my nutrition, took my nutrition to the next level, took my training to the next level. Showed up the following year in 2009. First day, I got out of the 6.2-mile swim with a 10-minute lead on the next guy. And I held that lead the entire day on the bike. I kept looking behind me, wondering when Alexander Ribeiro, the 4-time Ultraman champion from Brazil, was going to pass me. No matter how many times I looked behind me, I didn't see anybody. I didn't see another competitor the entire day. And I finished that day one maintaining a 10-minute lead on the next person. So I thought, that went pretty well. This plant thing seems to be working out just fine. 44 years old, doing something that I never thought I would ever be doing again after I turned 21. Unfortunately, day two didn't work out so well. About 35 miles into the 170-mile bike, my hand slipped off the handlebars. It was raining, and I went over the bars, went down, landed on my shoulder and my knee, scraped all the skin off my left shoulder, and banged my left knee up terribly, and more importantly, broke my pedal. I was on a stretch of the road on the Big Island called the Red Road. It's the one area in this whole race where they don't let the crew vehicles follow you. And I had about one more mile left on this section of road before I could reconnect with my crew. This time I recruited the crack crew of my wife and my two teenage boys. They didn't know anything either, but it was fun. Obviously, I wasn't going to ride another 150 miles on one pedal. So I gingerly got up, I got back on my bike, and with one foot kind of pedaled that final mile slowly to reconnect with my family, the van. And during that period of time, maybe you've experienced this as an athlete or in anything you're kind of focused on, that switch flicked from being hyper competitive and in the moment to completely checking out. I was like, wow, like, actually I could like bow.
Hey.
All right, thanks. So during that period of time, I thought, this is actually pretty good. I could like bow out of this incredibly painful experience and no one would fault me. Like, I just checked out. I was like, this race is over. I'm done. I got a broken pedal. There's nothing I can do about it. And I started to acclimate to that idea. I got used to that idea, like, you know, it's over. And you know what? I gave it a good go. There's nothing I can do about it. I show up at the end of the road, my wife gives me a hug, and I start dreaming about that bed that I'm going to be lying in and maybe taking the kids to the beach the next day and not having to finish this crazy, stupid race. And a crew member from one of the other crews, remember I told you all the crews help each other out? In Hawaii, they call it ohana, means family. This guy, Peter McIntosh, he was helping out another athlete. He comes up to me and he says, what kind of pedal do you need? Said I showed him the broken pedal, thinking he's not going to have it anyway. Disappears. 10 seconds later, he comes back with a brand new pedal. It was still in the box. The exact same pedal that I needed that would like match my shoe. It's like, where are you going with this? You don't understand. I'm done, man. This is over. Grabs my bike, puts a pedal back on my bike. He looks at me and he says, get on your bike and finish this goddamn race. I looked at him. He's a lot bigger than me. Didn't feel like I had a choice. So I did. I got back on my bike. It was not what I wanted to do. Trying to get back into that mindset after checking out was very, very difficult, and I suffered. My knee was killing me. My shoulder was killing me. I could barely bend my knee. It took me a long time to finish that next 150 miles on the bike. You can see me lying on the grass. That's what it looked like when I finished that stage of that day. I was not in good shape, but I was able to get through it. And I thought, well, I got through that, but there's no way I'm running 52 miles tomorrow. Like, my knee was seizing up. I was having a really hard time walking. And but I thought, well, I'll just show up the next day. I'll start walking in good faith, enjoy the spirit of this event, and I'll just see how it feels. So that's what I did. I showed up, started walking. The walk turned into a jog, and before I knew it, I was running. My knee loosened up, and I felt okay. Ended up getting through that double marathon and finishing that race. Of course, I was no longer winning the race, but I was able to claw myself back into contention on that day 3 and end up 6th in that race. And thank you. People always say, aren't you disappointed? Like, do you think you could have won? Do you think you could have been on the podium? Like, you know, don't you have regrets, or would you have done something differently? My response is that it was the perfect race. Because I remember back to that day in Jamba Juice when I read that article, and what captured my imagination wasn't the idea of racing or winning anything or PRs or how much time it was going to take me. I wanted to have a spiritual experience. I wanted to have a transformative experience. And when you're an athlete and you're in the race and everything, and you get all the breaks go your way and everything's going smooth and perfectly, you don't learn that much about yourself. It's only when you're down and the plan has to get thrown out the window and you're forced to improvise and dig deeper than you ever thought you would have to dig that you actually learn something more about who you are. That was what I was seeking out. That is exactly what I got from this race, and I wouldn't change a single thing about it. So, did I answer the question? I thought I did. I thought I'd answered it. I'm going to wrap up pretty quick here because I know I'm running long. I thought I'd answered the question. I felt pretty good about how resilient the human body was. I feel like I had shown that it was pretty resilient. And then this buddy of mine, Jason Lester, is a friend that I'd made who had competed in Ultraman a couple times. He came to me with this crazy idea he was working on. He called it Epic 5. And his plan was that he was going to do an Ironman distance triathlon a day on each of the 5 Hawaiian islands in 5 days. An Ironman a day, traveling from island to island to island, and complete it in 5 days. He asked me what I thought, and I said, knock yourself out, have a good time, and I will be happily on my couch here in Los Angeles, cheering you on from afar. But he wheedled me, and he said, I really want you to do this with me. I want you to do it. And I thought about all the endurance challenges that have been undertaken by man, going back to, Shackleton and the first person to climb Everest, and it seems like everything had already been done. All the summits have been climbed. Men have run across the Sahara Desert. People have raced their bikes across America without sleeping. There didn't seem to be any mountain that had not been conquered. And yet right here and now was a challenge that seemed so obvious, and yet no one had even tried to do it, let alone succeeding in doing it. And I knew I needed to try it. So that's what I did. I told Jason I would do it with him. And it's a long story. I tell it in Finding Ultra, which you guys have all read, right? You all read my book already? Yeah, so. This is day 4. We're in Maui. We've done 3 Ironmans already that week. It's about 10 o'clock at night. We just finished the bike leg in Maui, just finished riding 112 miles. It was the hardest, most painful day on a bike I'd ever experienced. I couldn't sit on my saddle anymore. My butt hurt so bad. I was dehydrated, exhausted, overheated. I remember riding my bike along this beautiful, pristine beach, and I didn't care. All I could think about was, if I could just lie my bike down on the ground, I could fall asleep in 5 minutes, no problem. As I'm finishing the final miles of this bike, every mile feeling like 100 miles, all I could think was, there is no way I'm running a marathon tonight. I can't even move my body. I am beyond exhausted. I have taken this far enough. Enough's enough. And I knew Jason felt the same way. By looking in his eyes, we're sitting here on this bumper, contemplating the idea of running a marathon, and neither of us wants to be the person to say we're calling it off and going home. I look like I'm about to tell him. Actually, he looks like he's more tired than me, but I think I was more tired than him. He ended up helping me out a lot that night. And I was just about to say, Jason, it's enough. I'm going back to the hotel. Maybe I'll run a marathon in the morning, but not tonight. And right then and there, we're parked in this little parking lot right by the beach, public beach in Maui. Again, it's like 10 o'clock at night, and out of the sand in the dark walks this woman in like a teal tank top, leathery skin from being in the sun too much. I'm sure she was, probably 10 years younger than how she appeared, drunk out of her mind. And there's about 7 of us in this little area here. You just see Jason and I, but we had our crew members and people that were helping us. A bunch of people she could have walked up to. She sees me, and she makes a beeline for me. She stumbles right up to me. She stands right on top of me, and she looks down at me, and she goes, "Hey, man, you want to party?" And I'm like, when you're this exhausted, even the slightest stimuli is like overwhelming. You can't handle it. I was like, could you please go away? Like, this is the last thing I want to deal with right now. I've got enough on my mind. I just kind of shirked her off, and she said, have it your way. And she just stumbled off into the darkness. And I'm sitting there kind of brewing this resentment over this bizarre encounter, glad that she's walked off. And then I realized she wasn't just some drunk old lady. She was like an angel. She was an angel that was sent there to me. She came right up to me to remind me that I'm just like her. That had I made a few different decisions than I'd made, that I could easily be her doing what she was doing. She made me reflect on this journey that I've taken. All the changes I'd implemented in my life that I thought were impossible. I could have never predicted sitting on this bumper on that night, given where I had been just a few years prior. She was a gift. As I started to think about that, I started to think about my grandfather, Richard Spindle, that I never met. How much he would have loved to have seen me be a swimmer. How much he would have loved to have been there on that bumper with us. And I could feel his presence, and I knew in some respects that he was there with us. I thought about all the naysayers, all my friends that were trying to talk me out of doing all this crazy stuff, told me I was insane, that told me I was unhealthy, that I was being irresponsible with my health. And then I thought about David Goggins, who once said, when you think you're done, you've actually only tapped into about 40% of what you're capable of. And with that, I knew I had to run that marathon that night. I don't remember the specifics. All I remember is that suddenly I had running shoes on my feet. And I was walking in the dark with Jason. And just like before, that walk turned into a jog. And that jog turned into a run. And before we knew it, we were trotting through the cane fields of Maui, which were in a controlled burn that night. The sun aglow, bright orange. Our t-shirts around our face to prevent the smoke from getting in our lungs. It was like a surreal scene out of like Apocalypse Now or some Salvador Dali painting. And we finished that marathon that night. And the next day, I got a good night's sleep. I woke up, and it was like that experience never happened. My body came back to life in a way I could have never predicted, and I finished that 5th Ironman on the Big Island of Hawaii like it was an afterthought, like it was a celebration, like it was a picnic compared to the pain I'd suffered earlier in that week. As I crossed the finish line in Kona, 5th Ironman in a week, completed on 5 different islands, Jason and I having done something nobody else had ever done before, I knew that I finally had answered that question. How resilient is the human body? And the answer is far beyond your wildest imagination. So, what's the point? I'm not a runner. I just listened to this long story by this crazy guy. I came here because I like vegan cupcakes. I want to go running. I'm exhausted listening to this guy. Wrap it up. The point is, Ultraman, Epic 5, they're just metaphors. They're my experience, but they're metaphors. They're metaphors for that better, more authentic version of ourselves that's locked inside all of us. They're metaphors for that dream deferred, yearning to come out. In my case, it was endurance sports. For you, it could be playing the banjo. It could be being a stand-up comic. It could be writing a novel. It could be anything. The point is, we all have that power, that internal power to unleash that better version of ourselves, to unlock it, to make it real, and that it's never too late. Plant-based nutrition, that's where it all started for me. Again, the key to wellness, the door that opened that made all of this possible. And when I say wellness, I don't just mean being trim, being healthy. I mean a holistic balance of mind, body, and spirit. It's not a fad. It's not a diet. It's not about some secret exercise routine. And it's not about a guru. You know, you hear amazing speakers at this event this weekend, but it's important to remember that it's about you. It's about self-empowerment. It's about self-responsibility. For me, plant-based nutrition was the key that unlocked my heart and made this crazy, fantastic journey possible. Journey I could have never predicted or imagined. And it all started because there was a crack in the door. There was a line in the sand. And I made the decision to walk over that line, to walk through that door. So hopefully you've been a little bit inspired, but we're human beings. You'll go home, that inspiration wanes. So each one of you has to think, you're leaving here now with your own crack in the door, your own line in the sand, and you just have to do one thing. You have to decide. Then dream big. Thank you. You can stay in touch with me. How I can be found online and stuff. I don't know if I'm signing books or not, but if I am, hopefully talk to you guys later. The paperback of my book, Finding Ultra, comes out next Wednesday. So if you haven't read it, buy it, book the book. Thanks. Thanks, you guys, for coming.